Hello and welcome back. Background tasks are crucial for building fast, reliable, and well-crafted applications. In today's video, we'll take a look at the new Expo Background Task module and how you can use it to run custom logic even when your app isn't open. Background tasks are super useful for things like syncing user data, downloading over-the-air updates ahead of time, prefetching content, and making sure your app feels instant when users come back. Let's dive in. Let's talk a little bit about some important things that you need to know about background task before we jump into coding. So let's start by checking out the demo. Today we're building a simple daily quotes app. Users get a new quote every day and they don't have to wait for it to load when you open the application. It quietly fetches quotes in the background using expo-background-task, saves them with async storage, and when the user opens the application, we perform a fast check and update the state to show the latest quotes from the local storage. This is going to work the exact same way for Android and iOS, and as always, the source code is going to be available in the description. So when do tasks run? What are the system constraints, best practices, and real use cases? Let's dive in. Background tasks run, of course, when the app is in background, but also there is a minimum interval of 12 hours, but you can actually set a minimum of 15 minutes to run your background task. So these background tasks are opportunistic and they rely on the network, battery, CPU usage, and user patterns. So that leads us to some constraints to keep in mind when using background tasks. So if the device has low battery, then the background tasks are going to be skipped. If the user, of course, does not have network connection or they have airplane mode activated, tasks are going to be skipped. There's also an option to turn off background app refresh. So as you notice there in the screenshot, I turn off for my application. That means that the background tasks are going to be off. And finally, if the user quits the application or kills the application by force quitting it, of course, background tasks are not going to be run. Since you depend on the system goodwill, let's talk a little bit about the best practices. It's good to keep tasks light and efficient. Avoid heavy work and batch multiple operations if possible. Some examples of good use cases for background tasks is syncing user data. So you can use a technology, for example, TorsoDB to sync the database or files or documents or progress of the user. You can do that in the background. Upload logs or telemetry, backup data, download over-the-air updates, for example, using EAS updates, and we have a code example that you can check out in the documentation of Expo updates. Another good use case is prefetching content for faster user experience, and that's technically what we are doing today with our application. So now let's start coding. I'm going to leave the link to the documentation of background task in the description of the video. But as always, guys, you can come here and learn more about each specific platform and use cases. Just a couple of things to know is that Expo Background Task relies on Expo Task Manager, which is another native module that provides an API that allows you to manage long-running tasks, in particular those tasks that can run while the app is in the background. And as you notice here, this library is actually used for multiple Expo modules like location, background task, background fetch, and notifications. And just as I note, background fetch is actually getting deprecated and you should be using background task in your application. Another important thing to know before we jump into coding is that you can only test background task on real devices for iOS, but actually they work nice on an Android emulator. So in today's video, I'm going to be using an iOS real device. So let's dive in. So here I have a project that I just created. It's a brand new Expo app. The first thing that I want to do is install dependencies. So I'm going to run npx expo installed, React Native async storage, Expo Task Manager, and Expo Background Task. So let's go ahead and hit enter. And I'm here in the package JSON, and we can quickly see that the dependencies have been installed. And just make sure that the Expo Background Task is inside the plugins. We are good to actually start creating a new development build that we can install on a real device. So I'm going to be using EAS, of course. I'm going to run EAS init, then select my account. I'm going to create a new project. Awesome. Now let's configure my profile. So I'm going to say EAS build configure. hit enter. So this is going to work, like I said before, for iOS and Android the exact same way. So I'm just going to configure now for iOS. This is going to generate my EAS JSON here, and I need to create a development build for internal distribution. And one thing that I want to do, because I want this to be fast, is to enable a large resource. So under resource class, you can choose large, and then I'm going to say EAS build platform iOS, passing the profile development. Hit enter. We need to install the expo dev client, so I'm going to say yes. This is another dependency, and we can double confirm that in here. So it added it by default for me. I'm going to choose the default bundle identifier and the standard encryption. I'm going to say yes. Let's log into my Apple developer account, select my team, reutilize my certificates, and just make sure that my device is listed here. Today, I'm going to be using the iPhone 13 Pro. So just going to hit enter. All right, and the build is in progress. Okay, so in the meantime, I think we're ready to start creating some utility functions that we're going to use to register our background task and also the logic that we want to run on the background task that we're going to be generating. So let's go ahead and create a new file called utils.ts. Let's start by importing background task, task manager, and async storage. I'm going to define some constants that I'm going to be using later, like the background task identifier. This is just a string determining how my task is going to be named. In this case, I'm going to name mine fetch quote task. Then let's set the minimum interval to be 15 minutes. This is good for testing, but actually I wouldn't recommend that you try to run your background task every 15 minutes. Well, I guess depends on what you're doing, but just keep in mind that it's not guaranteed that the background task is going to run every 15 minutes, right? So I would say it's better to assume that at least your background task is going to run once when the user is sleeping and the device is going to, find a good spot for running all the background task of the device. Then I'm also defining a quotes history key. This is the key for the async storage. So I'm going to be storing an array of quotes that I'm fetching in the background. And this is actually optional, that like the max history of items that I want to store. So I'm going to be setting this to 10 quotes maximum. The next thing that I'll do is just create a type for the data that I'm storing, since we are using TypeScript, of course. And I'm going to be using an API that returns a quote that looks like this. When it was created, I think, and the hour and timestamp. And then I'm just creating this type quote history, which is a list of quotes. And by the way, my build is ready. So let's go ahead and start the server. Okay. And let me scan this QR code to download the build. Let's install it. Now I can scan the other QR code for the server. This is going to open the application. First time it's going to ask me to allow access to the network. So let's allow that and then reload the bundle. Awesome. And just like that, we have our app running on a real device, ready to start developing. Okay, so let's minimize the terminal. Next, I want to create a function called initialize background task. This function is going to register the task and also run the logic that I want to run for this specific task. So this is an arrow async function, and this function is going to expect an inner app mounted promise. This is a promise to let know this function once the JavaScript of the application is loaded, so that we can run JavaScript code. And we're going to pass this promise from our component. So when the component bounds, you can think of it like using a use effect. We can call this inner mounted promise, and then we can let know this initial background task that the JavaScript is ready to run logic. So let's start by calling the task manager and define a task. The name of my task is going to be background task identifier, and this is going to take an async function, which is the function that contains the logic of this task. So first of all, let's add a console log here. I'm gonna say background task started. So in my case, I want to do a couple things here, like fetch a new quote, save it to local storage, and I think that's it. So I'm going to just add another console log here, just so that we know that the task is done if we hit this point. Now, but something important here is that since I'm going to be using async storage to store my new quotes, I need to make sure that the JavaScript of my application is loaded so that we can actually call async storage. And for that, we're going to be awaiting the inner app mounted promise. This means that we're going to delay starting the task until the inner app is mounted. Once that is done, we can actually start fetching the quote. So I'm going to have a try catch. And if you want, we can have another console log here. And this one could say something like error fetching quotes. Now it's time to use the API that we want to hit in the background. And I'm going to be using this one right here. And, it just returns a simple quote with this structure. I'm grabbing a random one using the regular fetch. So let's grab the quotes. This is going to be an array of quotes. And we can say await response.json. All right, now we can say if we actually have some quotes and quotes.length is greater than 0, we need to save this quote. So let's call await store quote history, and let's pass the quotes at position 0. Okay, now let's go ahead and actually implement this function. I'm going to create this function down here. This is going to be an async function, and it's going to take the quote as parameter. Let's create a try catch. If something goes wrong, let's just put it in the console for now. So before I save into the local storage, I want to first get the current history that I have. So let's get the history.json equal to await async storage get item, and let's pass the quotes history key. Let's grab the history if it actually exists. So if this is actually a value, we can parse it. Otherwise, we return an empty list. And we can type this as quote history. Okay, so let's grab the new quote from the one that we are getting in the parameters. But I want to add a new field, which is the timestamp. And this timestamp is when this quote was fetched. So we can say date.now. This is useful for debugging so that we know when the task was triggered. So now let's append this new quote to the history. I'm going to create a new variable updated history, which is an array where I'm going to be including these new quotes at the beginning of the array, and then whatever we already had on the history. And that's it. Now this is optional, but I'm going to slice this to be from 0 to maximum size, which is 10. This is totally optional. If you want, you can just keep appending stuff. And it's also worth noting actually that you can check the history and check the last item. And maybe if the last item is from today as well, maybe you want to skip fetching and instead waiting until the last quote fetched it's outdated, right? And then go ahead and fetch again and hit the API. But at this point, I want to fetch as many as possible. Okay, now we can store it. I'm gonna say async storage, set item, let's pass the key, quotes key, and the value is going to be updated history. But of course, this needs to be a string. So let's call JSON stringify. Finally, let's return the updated history and hit save. If we come back just to recap, we are checking that the response contains at least one quote, and then we store it in the history. And that's all the logic that this background task is going to have. So let's go ahead and minimize this task define. And after this, I want to actually register the task. Since we're going to be calling this function from my component, we are defining the task, but we need to register the task if we haven't already. So I'm going to have an if statement, and I'm going to check if, let's use the task manager to check if the task is registered async. We are going to use the background task identifier, and this is going to return true or false. So if it is not registered, then we want to go ahead and register the task by saying await background task dot register task async. This is going to take the task name. Let's pass the identifier, and then it's going to take some options. And the options that it expects is just the minimum. I mean, it's not expected, it's actually optional. You can skip this if you want, but I'm going to set this to be the minimum interval variable, which is 15 minutes. And you can learn more about it just by hovering. It defaults to once every 12 hours. And the minimum interval is 15 minutes, which is what I'm setting right here. And just keep in mind that on iOS, short intervals are often ignored. And the system typically runs background tasks during specific windows, such as overnight, like I said before. So let's go ahead and hit save. So we're defining the task and registering the task if it's not registered already. And that's all the logic that this initialize background task function is going to have. Now let's go back to the index of my application just to make sure that we are still connected. Let's say hello bg tasks. Hit save. Okay, we got library loading, which means this is working. And let's use our initialized background task function. Okay, now this is going to take a promise that is going to help so that we can wait until the promise is resolved to run our logic. So let's create this resolver promise. This is going to be a void function or null. So this variable is going to help us store the resolver function. And then I'm going to create a promise. So I'm going to say promise equal to new promise. So this is just creating a promise and storing the resolve function for later. And we are storing this resolve in this variable resolver. Then I'm going to pass the promise here. Notice that this promise is not going to be resolved until we call this resolver. And we can call it using a use effect inside our component. So let's check if we have a resolver. Then we can just call resolver and we can, put in the console resolver called. And this is resolving the promise to indicate that the inner app has mounted. Okay, so if you remember inside this initialize background task, when we are running the logic of the task, we need to make sure that the inner app is loaded, right? So this is why we are passing this promise. And this is going to await here until the use effect is mounted or the component is mounted. So let's hit save. Now I see on the log that the resolver was called. All right, so now we can start defining some state for our quotes. I'm going to be using useState from React, and we can also import our type from the utilities. Let's go ahead and create a new utility function to load the quotes from the async storage. This is going to be a fairly simple function, get quote history. It's an async function that just hits the async storage with the quotes history key. And then if we have some data, it's going to return it. Otherwise, it's going to return null. Okay, so let's hit save. Let's go back and we can use that function here. Let's create a function down here to load the quote history, which is going to call this get quote history function. And then if we actually have some data, we are setting the quote history state here. Now let's call this load quote history inside the use effect. Okay, so this is just basically going to load the history the first time the user opens the application. So the next thing that I want to do is come all the way here. And just for debugging, I'm going to import all as task manager. And we can just put in the console all the registered tasks that we have running. And as you notice, my task is actually registered. Let's try to reload the application just to see what happens. And we get the same task again. Okay, so now that we know that the task is registered, we can actually trigger it manually for debugging. Let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to create a button here. Let's call it trigger task, and on press, create an async function here. And then we can use background task. So I'm going to come here and copy this import. Okay, let's go down here again. And we can say await background task, trigger task worker for testing async. Now it is very important to know that this is only going to work for debugging. And basically what this is doing is just calling whatever we have inside here, inside of the task that we defined. So this is going to trigger the fetch. So let's see what happens. I'm going to clear my terminal and press trigger task. And as you notice, we started the task and the task is done. Let's try to put the history list on screen. So for that, I'm going to paste quickly here some styles. Let's import style sheet from React Native. And I'm going to render a simple view here. This is just a simple view that is iterating over the history. So if we actually have a history, we are going to render, in this case, the latest quote. And then after that, I'm rendering the previous quotes. So since I triggered this manually, you can see that this actually worked. We are seeing some data on screen. Right now, if I go back or close the app like that and come back, nothing is going to happen because we actually need to wait. It's actually hard to test. And in my experience, I had to leave my application like 15 minutes there. And you can actually lock the device, like close the application, lock the device, and leave it there for like 15, 20 minutes, and the task should run. So if you want, we can trigger the task again. Okay, task started, task is done. And then let's close the app and let's come back to the app. Now, nothing is happening, although we know that the background task was triggered. And we also know that we now have 2 quotes, but we only see 1. So a good approach here would be to check when the app is foregrounded and when the app is coming from the foreground. And when that happens, hit again the local storage and see if we have new data. And to do that, we can actually use the app state. We can import app state from React Native, and I'm going to be using as well a ref from React. And the app state allows us to subscribe to state of the application. Like if the app is foregrounded, we are going to know, and then we can run some logic. So after I'm loading my quote history, I'm going to be using the same use effect to create a subscription. So I'm going to call this app state subscription. Let's call app state dot add event listener. Okay, so we are going to subscribe to change. And when something changes with this event, I'm going to run this function. Now this function actually gets the next app state as parameter. This is going to be of type app state status. So we can import this from React Native as well. Let's hit save. Okay, and there the application reloaded. So we fetched the previous quote. But yeah, let's keep going. So in here, we can validate if the app state dot current from the reference, and then we can match this to be inactive or background. If this is true, and the next app state it's equal to active, this actually means that the app has come to the foreground. So we can try to call load history again. Okay, and after this if statement, I'm going to set my app state current to be equal to the next app state. Let's hit save. Okay, so let's try this. I'm going to close the app and then come back. And you notice that we get the log. Apps has come from the background, the foreground, sorry. And let's do it again. We have the log. And we can have a similar validation to know when the app has gone to the background. So if I add this just to match that the app was active and the next one is background, it means that now we are in the foreground. So if I close the app, I should be able to see that log. Let's see. Okay, so I refresh the application. Now I'm going to close it. App has gone to the background. Then if we come back, we get the log as well. And when we come back, of course, we are calling the load quote history. So that means that if I trigger the task manually, okay, we did that successfully. Now I'm going to close the application. Let's pretend that the task was actually triggered while the application was closed. And then let's say that is next day. I'm coming to my app, open the application, and boom, I'm hitting the async storage, which is super fast, and I get the latest quote at the top. Now, one more thing that I almost forgot is that we need to clean up the subscription when we unmount the component. And that's it for this video, guys. I hope you like it. I hope you learned something new. Background tasks definitely are a super powerful feature that you can integrate in your application. Check out our docs to learn more about expo-background-task, task manager, and how you can use it with expo updates. Don't forget to give it a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.